Good evening, dear friends, a student at the State University of Moscow. I'm very happy to have been invited by you to give a lecture, a normal lecture. I will focus on some problems related to the meaning of the October 17 revolution and its influence on history until today and continuing for the future. But before going straight forward into that subject, I want to make some general observation about my methodology, my way of thinking and of analyzing historical facts and their impact on real history. First, we are today, and we ought to look at the past knowing where we are today. We are today in a stage which could be called late monopoly capital, but I prefer to qualify this late monopoly capital by calling it generalized monopoly capital. I mean that we have capitalism has reached a degree of centralization of the control, and I'm saying of the control, not the property of capital in general, which has nothing to do with what it was only 50 years ago. We were already in monopoly capital since 100 years and more, but the level, the degree of centralization of the control of monopoly capital over the productive systems, the economic capitalist productive systems, has reached a level which has never been before. Now, and this has led to a centralization of the power of capital, whether the economic power of monopoly capital, financialized monopoly capital, but also the degree of centralization of political power in the imperialist developed capitalist countries, that is the triad, United States, Europe and Japan, but also a centralization or a control of the all aspects of social life, including what is called the lato sensu cultural, through the total control of the media, which we had never had before. Which means that we have reached a stage of late capitalism, which has transformed the system in a kind of totalitarian system. That is a system where we have de facto a single power, the power of capital, which is economic, political, media, cultural. It has domesticated the political parties, the traditional historical parties, whether of the right or of the left, to the extent that now voting has lost its meaning. You can vote left or right. The next day the parliament meets and says the market needs this and that to be done. Well, why do we vote? Why do we select politicians to rule the country if they do not rule the country and they leave the so-called market, which means monopoly capital, to rule it? Now, that is, in my opinion, a sign of decline of capitalism, a sign of, I would say, dare say, decadence of the system, because it has reached a point where it must be replaced by a objectively need. There is an objective need to replace it by another social system, another political system, another economic system of a higher level. Now, this is my first point, because many people tend to think, particularly after the breakdown of the Soviet Union and of socialism in the Soviet Union, that capitalism is there forever. It has been said that there is no alternative to capitalism, and therefore we have to live and accept this system as it is. Now, the second point I wish to do is that that new stage of monopoly capital has moved into a deep crisis, a systemic crisis, and not since the financial breakdown of 2008, no, long before, since the mid-70s. Since the mid-70s, suddenly, around 1975, the rates of growth of the triad, US, Europe and Japan, fell to half of their had been on the average during the 30 previous years, and they never recovered, which means that it is a permanent long crisis of accumulation. Now, this is not the first long crisis. The first long crisis started exactly or almost exactly 100 years before, towards the end of the 19th century, and continued. Now, what was the response or the solution given to that first long crisis? It was not a good economist who could imagine the solution, the economic rational solution, and good governments would implement them. No. The response to the crisis were, as I say, a series of negligible events. The First World War, the Russian Revolution, the crisis of '29, the rise of Nazism, the rise of Imperial Japan, the Second World War, the Chinese Revolution, Bandung, and the reconquest of their independence by the Asian and African countries. That was the solution to the crisis, which means the crisis does not have a solution imagined by economists. It was not Keynes. Keynes was recognized late after the Second World War. That means when the solution was provided to the crisis by gigantic political and social changes, for better or for worse. You had socialism, but you had Nazism, you had etc. Now, which means that the response to that crisis in which we are now, the second systemic crisis of declining capitalism, of decadent capitalism, the second crisis will not find its solution by a conference of good economists listened and by good governments clever enough to implement it. No, it will lead to it has created a ground and for gigantic struggles. I don't know of what type, of any type, social, political, ideological struggles within a country, in a society, struggles between countries, wars. So we will have not a replica, we will not have necessarily the same pattern of answers as those which were given to the first crisis, but something similar, which means that we have entered into an era, a period of chaos, of, let's call it, wars and revolutions, and all kinds of things of that kind. This is my introduction, because we ought, therefore, to read our history since 1917 in that framework. I mean, we need to read the answers which were given to the long crisis, just as on the basis of the same methodology, we could say something about the possible alternative futures, the best and the worst, and see what are the preconditions, what are the conditions for having at least not the worst but the best moving ahead gradually. Now, in that frame, and I come to my subject, which is 1917, not a history of 1917 with the details, because this is very well known and you have references and so on. No, but the lesson of 17 and what was the consequences of 17, not only for Russia and the Soviet Union, which were built as a result of October 17, not only for them, but for the world. Because I would say, in a nutshell, we cannot understand the world in which we live together today without 1917. Without 1917, I don't think that we would have had a Chinese Revolution, or at least not of that time. I don't think that we would have had also the relatively easier victory of the nations and peoples of Asia and Africa reconquering their independence after the Second World War. We would not have today what is being called the so-called emerging nations or countries, that are countries of the South, which seem to be successful in one way or another in moving fast into economic growth, industrialization, etc. We would have nothing of that kind, which means that 1917 is not a Russian event. It is a global event, and it is an event by itself, but an event which opened on a long process, the one which was called traditionally by the Soviet and the Marxists in general, building socialism in one country. And this is why I consider that the Russian Revolution, October 17, is what I call a great revolution. There have been not many great revolutions in modern history. I'm speaking of modern history. I think, I submit that we have had three great revolutions in modern times. The French Revolution, not 1789, which was like February, but 1793, which was the popular, the convention and the popular peasant revolution, which led, of course, in the circumstances and in the frame of its time to finally building a capitalist nation. But it is the French Revolution which invented modern politics, that is, which invented bourgeois democracy, which invented left and right, that is, political conservative organizations and parties, and political non-conservatives who wanted progress, wanted to organize progress, etc. Similar is October 1917. Similar is October 1917, because October 1917 led to, Lenin was very optimistic, and I don't consider this having been a mistake or something dangerous. He knew that the first revolution, October, was in a underdeveloped society, a society which was not among the most developed capitalist countries. He knew it, of course. But he qualified it. He said the revolution started in the weak link, Russia. But he thought that it will spread historically in a short period. He didn't say next week or next month, but quickly, within some years perhaps, in at least some of the most developed European industrialized countries. That did not happen. And I don't think it did not happen because of some mistakes made by the German revolutionaries, because they were revolutionaries, among others, No, it was not. It did not happen because the imperialist societies of Western Europe, Germany, Britain, and France, basically, had created conditions which did not permit a revolution to have a strong echo in the society. And it is Rosa Luxemburg who used a very tragic qualification of that, not me. She spoke of she said the proletariat in Germany, France and Britain, and she said in the three countries have betrayed the revolution. And therefore Russia finds itself isolated for a long time, until the Chinese Revolution, I may say, that is after World War II. Russia and Soviet Union were isolated. And therefore, the call for a global revolution, which is in itself not an ugly call, is romanticism. Because we had to deal, the Russians and the Soviet had to do in an isolated country, even if a big one, fortunately, geographically, but an isolated country facing the challenge of the capitalist enemy, which remained an enemy during the whole period until now, I would say. There are not very much more chances or conditions for a revolution or a revolutionary advance or move in Europe today or in the United States than yesterday. That is a tragedy, and we ought to know what could be done in order to at least create some conditions more favorable in the West, anti-imperialism. Now, that was the first challenge that the Soviet, on the basis, as a result, of course, of 1917, October, there was the building of the Soviet Union. But here also, and the isolation. I will come later on this major point, how the Soviet dealt with the challenge of their isolation. But simultaneously, I would say, February was an attempt of a bourgeois, so-called democratic revolution, which had no future, no possibility of becoming a response to the challenge of the time. Because the Russian bourgeoisie was too weak, and the reactionary forces, the Tsarists saying, and their supporters, the Germans and the Western powers, the both camps in the First World War, their supporters were so strong enough that, which means that if the revolutions had stopped for some reasons at February, it's not the cadet and the bourgeois democratic or semi-democrat who would have won. It would have been a restoration of the Tsarist most reactionary power. Therefore, there would have been, of course, no peace. The war would have probably continued. Second, there would have been no land for the peasants, because the big owners would have remained big owners, etc., etc. Which means that a bourgeois revolution was not on the agenda. And Lenin and Mao later were very right in saying that capitalism has reached, since monopoly capital and its first long systemic crisis, a point where now the epoch is no more the epoch of bourgeois revolutions, but of socialist revolutions. socialist revolution, the epoch of. But in between February and October, and particularly during the summer, the Russian army disintegrated, and a great number of the soldiers ran away to go into their villages and seize the land. And they have done it. And seized the land in quality of small owners, unequally. Some who had some means got more. They became the kulak. Others less. But everybody took something. So Lenin was in front of a fait accompli. There had been a peasant revolution. That is, not only the proletariat of Petrograd and perhaps some other towns, Moscow and some other towns, not many at that time, had struggled for a revolution, in the name of socialism, but the peasants had won that revolution. This is why the October Revolution was followed by the new Soviet power controlling 80% of Russia. Most of Russia. Peacefully, because the peasants were supporting that revolution since they got the land. Lenin was clever enough to legitimize that revolution by the decree on land. Say, you have taken the land is given to you by the state. Now, but that raised a gigantic new challenge. How to associate in the longer run the peasants, who were the majority, the absolute majority at that time in Russia, to a construction, a gradual construction of another society, aiming at being socialist, and even I would say communist, because Lenin was not a socialist, he was a communist, and the change of the name of the party into Communist Party was precisely to recall and remind to the people that the target is a socialist transition to communism. Now, how to keep them integrated, associated them in that long construction? Now, I will look at those two challenges, because they are interconnected, of course. Those were the two challenges that, whether we like or not, Soviet power had to deal with, whether the Soviet power of Lenin and after Lenin of Stalin had to deal with this double challenge. One on the question of isolation. They tried to get as much as possible peaceful coexistence with the capitalist imperialist countries. That is, they did not say, and they never attempted, to export the revolution by military invasions. They thought, rightly, that if there are revolutionaries and conditions for revolution, the people will do it themselves. We will be with them, of course, but we cannot replace them and do the revolution, export the revolution. And therefore, there is a room for peaceful coexistence. But the West never accepted the peaceful coexistence. Never accepted it. First, during 3 or 4 years, they were military interventions of 14 countries against the revolution. There was not civil war. There was an external aggression. Therefore, when some people say that, oh, the revolution is a very painful thing, it leads to a civil war with millions of people victims of it on one side and on the other, on both sides, and therefore it's a tragedy. It would not have been a tragedy without the intervention of the Western imperialist countries. First the German until Brest-Litovsk, and then the French and the British and the American and even the Japanese in the Far East. So, and that was through their support to Wrangel, Denikin, etc., through their military support, not only money and armament, but also military intervention, that the new Soviet socialist power had to deal with that and win the war. And they won the war. But then after the war, after having won the war, there was continuous isolation. There was a continuous policy, I would call it Cold War. Cold War is not something new after Second World War. There was a Cold War during the whole 20s and 30s until 41, which turned into a hot war then. Lenin died in 24. Stalin, who followed, had to deal with that isolation and Cold War. And he continued the policy of attempting a kind of peaceful coexistence. When Germany turned to Nazism as of 1933, he offered an alliance with the relatively democratic, at least non-fascist countries, Britain and France, against Hitler Germany. That was rejected by the French and the British, who went to Munich and offered to Hitler, after having accepted the Anschluss with Austria, offer him the Sudetenland and practically the protectorate on Bohemia and Moravia, and hoping and pushing him, oh Hitler, please go and attack Soviet Union. Go and attack Soviet Union. I think that Stalin was right to try to have it. But having failed, not because he failed, but because the others, the French and the British, did not want, he could, at the last minute, avoid the aggression against Soviet Union by this famous arrangement with von Ribbentrop in 1941, and which he knew in 39, which he knew would give to Soviet Union only a short relative, but some time. That was after World War II. Stalin tried again to have a peaceful coexistence with the Western powers, Britain and the United States, and a solid one. And Yalta was not a divide and impere, a partition of the world between the two, between the superpowers, the new superpower, United States and its allies, Britain and France and some others, on the one hand, and Soviet Union on the other, the common talk on Yalta. No, because what the Soviet obtained in Yalta was just at least to have a range of countries favorable to them and not operated and controlled possibly again in the future by the Germans, Poland, Hungary, etc. Not more than that. But it was later, not much later, in Potsdam, when the Americans had the nuclear power and knew they had it, and they used it a few weeks later against Japan. But they had made already experiences and they knew that they had a terrible power. That they decided the Cold War against Soviet Union. The Cold War was not a decision of Stalin, as is being said. It was a decision of Truman, in fact of Churchill, because Truman was like 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 Trump, not very clever. But Churchill was speaking for him and created the so-called Iron Curtain and legitimized the creation of NATO as of 49, as a so-called defensive against a Soviet Union which had absolutely no thinking at all of invading Western Europe and menacing them. So that was now, and that Cold War continued. And mind you, it continues today against Russia, in spite of Russia, as of 91 at least, being officially and really a capitalist country. And some Russians, very naive, thought that because now we are no more socialists, we are capitalists, the capitalist Western countries will help us rebuilding a efficient capitalism. Not at all. What they are doing is destroy Russia. Why? Because they cannot accept a country, whatever it is, socialist or not socialist, which would not accept the ruling of what I'm calling the collective imperialism of the triad that is united under the leadership of United States, Europe and Japan. But that is a set of problems to which I may come later if I have time. Now, that is how the problem of isolation was therefore met. But it meant that when the United States had the atom bomb, I think there was no other choice for Soviet Union than try to have it as fast as possible. And therefore move into a armament competition with the US. And therefore we had indeed a kind of military bipolarity, but not more than that. Military bipolarity. We had no bipolarity after World War II. We had this multipolar system with at least 4 sets of actors. One, NATO plus Japan, which means the new collective imperialism under the leadership of United States, Europe and Japan. Second, the Soviet Union. Third, China, which succeeded in its revolution as of 1949-50, and therefore, but was always had views and a relatively independent vision, because it's a second big revolution, also great revolution, and that is absolutely normal. But we had also, thanks to that new less balance of forces, a fourth actor, which was the South. The countries which met in Bandung, basically at that point in time, the Asian and African countries, nations and then countries, because most of them reconquered their independence quite fast, in one way or another, which had a margin of maneuver and was a fourth partner. So we had a multipolar system, and indeed with a variety of economic and political practices. You had in the West the real and good social democracy, which was made possible because of the danger for the capital, particularly in Europe, of the communist attraction or model. You had, therefore, the social democrat system of that time, which achieved a lot of things in favor of the labor classes, and I think this is historically positive. I don't consider it that it was, because it was not revolutionary and not destroying capitalism, that it was negative. We had the two patterns of building socialism, the Soviet one, which continued, and the Chinese new one, the Maoist. And we had a series of experiences of what I call attempts of a national, popular, or relatively popular pattern of independent or autonomous development in many countries of the South, such as Nasser and others. I have no time to go into qualifying those systems and the variety of those systems. But we had that. Now, I go to the second challenge, the agrarian question. Because here it is being said today, but today only, and I mean after World War II, not just that the collectivization decreed by Stalin and made as of 1930 and the first plans, the second plans before World War II have been a gigantic failure and even criminal choice and so on and so forth. I beg your pardon. I don't want to say that it was a peaceful change which did not have destructive aspects. It had. But we ought to know why this choice was made. At that point in time, I mean in the 30s, everybody believed that the future of agriculture is large, industrialized pattern. Everybody. And when I say everybody, that was the vision of all socialists, including the socialists of the Second International. Kautsky wrote that in 1899. And Lenin inherited that. He disagreed with Kautsky on other important questions, the World War, but on that question, he considered that the book on the agrarian question of Kautsky was a good book. But not only the socialists thought that way. The bourgeois thinking was also convinced that small agriculture has no future. It's a legacy of the past, and that the future is industrialized agriculture. The debate was therefore only on who owns that industrial grade big agriculture. The bourgeois would say private companies, and the socialists and the communists say no. Cooperatives, state, I mean public property. But the pattern, the technical pattern was the same. So we cannot say that Stalin had very particular opinion on that ground and bad ones, because that was the opinion of everybody. But in that case, creating fast, quickly, within a few years of collectivization, big industrial, agrarian, agricultural enterprises created a problem. Because the peasants who had taken the land in 1917, before October, had taken the land as owners. And even the small owners, I don't want to go into much details, were often closer to listen to the kulak, the big or larger owners, than to the Soviet who would take the land from them, suppress the private property. And this is what led indeed to horrors and to relative failure, that is no good results in agriculture production. But I would say that also that was a consequence of how to face isolation. That is, in order to face isolation, and knowing that isolation will lead to normally not only Cold War, permanent Cold War, but possibly hot war, and that is coming. We have to accelerate industrialization and particularly armament. That was the choice of Stalin. And that choice, we should be thankful for him. Because if Soviet Union had not accelerated in the second half of the 30s industrialization and created a good armament industry, it would not have won the war against the Nazis. And where would we be together? Where the Russian nation would be together today? Where the world would be today if Soviet Union had lost the war? But it won the war. And it won the war alone. Stalingrad was the end of Nazism. Well, the Western powers entered in France in June 1944, when the Red Army had already defeated de facto the Nazis. And they moved in just in order to prevent Soviet Union, Red Army, from liberating alone the whole Europe until Madrid and Lisbon. What would have come out of that, I don't know. Certainly not a big dictatorship of a Soviet, not the type of relations that they could have with Poland, for instance, after World War II. That would have created, with a big Germany, with a big France, with a big Spain, with a big Britain, absolutely different conditions. But that was a possible better future. Now, so that was how. Now I come to the end. That is, no, I don't come immediately to the end. Stalin died in 1953. Khrushchev came in 1956, I think, or 1954. And then after Brezhnev. And I think that all the answers which were given to the challenge of modernization of the Soviet Union were thought in a reactionary way. That is, not by associating more the people, by democracy, not democracy in the Western sense, pluripartism and elections, but in the sense of giving to the Soviet people a real capacity to, opportunity and capacity to manage by himself a system which was becoming more and more complex, and therefore move from, let's call it, a state socialism to socialization, which is something other, which is a system in which the people, it's not self-management necessarily. This is one of the formula possible with its own limitations and problems, but a variety of forms which give more power. No, the reforms were conceived in a pseudo-technocratic way. That is a better, more clever pattern of planning. All the schools which have developed, particularly the Novosibirsk school and others, I have gone into some detail in my second book on October 17, the one which will be translated in Russian soon, on those aspects, looking in detail into this conservative, which means that the initiative was taken, I will call them, by the potential bourgeoisie, the new bourgeoisie, coming out of the nomenclatura. You know, there is a very good image which was given to me by a Russian some years ago. He says the system has become like Russian dolls. Outside, the big doll is public ownership, but inside it's private. De facto privatization. And what happened with Gorbachev and Yeltsin was that the private broke the outside doll and said, we are the private private owners now of the Soviet wealth, public wealth. Now, which means that what we had was, I would say, not a counter-revolution, but an acceleration of the process which was already in the system, at least, and I don't say as of Stalin, but after Stalin. And we can discuss whether it was as of Khrushchev or as of Brezhnev for sure, possibly before. Now, that was what happened, and that was the tragedy of that revolution, which ended as it ended. That means a restoration. The restoration has led to what it has led. One, a political catastrophe, the explosion of the Soviet Union, and the gigantic catastrophe of the so-called independence of Ukraine, and the expansion of NATO. The Western power says no to Gorbachev, no, NATO will not move beyond the beyond the boundary of the former boundary of the Eastern countries, Eastern Europe. It moved the next day to Narva, to the boundary of Russia today. It moved to Georgia, to Ukraine, and so on. That was the result. The second result was that what remained of the Soviet Union, the biggest state, geographically, Russia, but only half of the population of the former Soviet Union, became a periphery which, in the logic of the global imperialist capitalist system, is a periphery to be plundered to produce and offer oil and gas, and possibly some other raw material. Full stop. Nothing else. That is, the plan is destroying Russia after having destroyed Soviet Union. Now, how from there the Russian people and possibly the ruling classes will react to it, I don't know, but there are some not bad signs, I would say, not necessarily very good signs. That is that it seems that the Russian people and nation, and perhaps part at least of the establishment, political establishment, do not imagine or accept Russia being downgraded to that level. And that is the reason for the continuing Cold War. Now, after that experience, the Chinese, Mao learned from the Russian Revolution. He learned a lot. And one major point that he learned out of it, that what we are going to have is not a proletarian socialist revolution, it's a people's revolution with, in majority, vast majority, peasants. And therefore, but it's not a bourgeois revolution. And he said, and he wrote it, and as of 1940, in Yan'an, not a bourgeois democratic stage, but a people's democratic stage. And the name of China until now is not socialist Republic of China, but the People's Republic. Which means that we ought indeed to take into account, and if we may, better than Soviet, associating the peasant in the long run to the building of, we'll see, potentially and possibly stages and moves towards socialism. Possibly, not more than that. Mao never said that socialism has won in China. He said socialism is possible thanks to the people's revolution, and thanks, of course, to the fact that the people's revolution was conducted, to a certain extent, directed by a communist party with a socialist perspective and with a Marxist tools. Now, and this is why Mao never imagined that the peasants' revolution must lead to small property. No, state property from the beginning. Not an agrarian reform which transferred the property to small peasants. No, state property. But state property associated with giving the land, not as property, the access to the land, equally, or let's say to be modest, as equally or as less unequally as possible to all the peasant families, and having therefore for a long transitional period a perspective of small farming but not small property farming. Now, and this until now is maintained. There have been a history with, I cannot go into its details, some movements towards achieving some forms of collectivization, but never of the Soviet type, never. Very simple as compared to the world, and maintaining the fundamentals of the peasant family farming. Now, I think this has been an asset for China, is an asset for China until now. There are pressures, of course, to dismantle that and to move towards private property and therefore agrarian capitalism. But there are resistance, and not only resistance by officially, until now, the party and the government, but also, and that is no less important, by the peasants themselves. So, that is one. Second, precisely because of the Cold War, not the Cold War, because of the military bipolarity, the Chinese were not compelled to move as the Russians were, the Soviets were, unfortunately, but they were compelled to move into a military competition with the US. Yes, Zhou Enlai had from the very beginning, and they were right with Mao, the four modernization including the army, but without necessarily being faced by a menace of immediate danger of war, as the Soviet Union was before World War II, and World War II proved that they were not wrong to expect it. And that created the conditions for their choosing economic competition rather than military competition. And that leads, and that will be my conclusion because it opens in the future, to a very funny, ambiguous, dangerous, but also with its potentials, present situation, not only of China, but of the world. That is, the Chinese project is built on a contradiction. On the one hand, to modernize the economy by creating and developing a full-fledged industrial system, auto-centered, but auto-centered with a country of 1,300,000,000, that is not export-oriented, articulated, connected with a renewal of the peasant farmer land, access to land, through with a economic policy of the state, a kind of planning, even not of the Gosplan type, but planning, on the one hand. And on the other hand, that goes along with participating to the globalization, the capitalist globalization, by opening to trade, taking advantage of what is very ugly export industry based on cheap manpower and exploitation. That is also accepting, inviting foreign investment, but trying to control this foreign investment. The countries which do not control foreign investments, such as Egypt today, or all the countries today of Latin America, Asia, except China, include half-half with respect to India, or to a certain extent, do not attract capital. It's very funny to see that the country which is controlling foreign investment does attract more. Now, but also not participating to the financial globalization that is keeping the total control until today of the monetary and financial system of China. Now, that is their project, the Chinese project, and this is the reason for the emerging China. Now, the question is where that does lead, could lead, can it continue, and to which extent it could become a model. I don't like the word model, but inspiring with differences, experiences, or choices for the others, including Russia, but including also other countries of the periphery, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. First, this project, the Chinese project, is, as I said, a project based on conflict. But you see, I go there to a question. People have debates and debates by trying to qualifying the Soviet Union. Was Soviet Union socialist? Was it socialist until 1991? Or was it socialist until some year before and then not anymore? Was it capitalist, disguised in a socialist country? And today the same debate about China. Is China socialist? And we can answer very easy, certainly not. Is China capitalist? Capitalism without private property of land is a curious capitalism. Capitalism with a state control of the monetary and financial system in contemporary globalization is funny. It is not. Both societies are societies, which means we are in a long historical transition, possibly from capitalism for sure, possibly to communism through stages of socialism, possibly, not necessarily. And therefore, in those societies, you have aspects of capitalism and obvious aspects. For a worker in a Soviet industry, for a worker today in a Chinese industry, what is the difference between the way he is treated and the way division of labor and so on of a wage earner in a capitalist country? Very little. Even if possibly he has some rights, depends on the timing, on the time and the place. So we have to say that is a useless exercise to qualify. We should recognize that these societies, as all societies which will go beyond capitalism towards communism, they will be during a long period with internal struggle between capitalist tendencies and let's call them socialist tendencies. We can call it class struggle in a simplified way. It is, but it's not only class struggle, it is also political and ideological struggle about how to organize the state, how to organize the development of the management of the society, etc., etc. Now, we are today facing that challenge globally. Now, my last word was, what I said seems to be relevant only for the peripheries. That is Russia, which was a periphery and remain a periphery, China, which is obviously, in spite of the success of its development, and the other countries of Asia, Africa and Latin America. But what about the West? What about the West? And here is the point very important and dramatic. I think the possibility and the capacity of, and I would say the people, the working classes in the Western countries, particularly in Europe. I'm not speaking about United States and Japan. I think they are two backward societies, I would say in a caricature way, perhaps as backward as Saudi Arabia in their way, but not Europe, not Europe. There is a historical tradition in Europe of left thinking, and I mean the French Revolution had an important role. It's not by pure chance that you had the first attempt, which was the Paris Commune. The Revolution of '48 had echo in all Europe, in Austria-Hungary, in Germany, everywhere. So I think that means that there is a potential in Europe to become a little lucid about the blind alley in which Europe had put itself by moving behind the United States, NATO and so on, in the collective imperialism of the Triad. Now, we are at that point, and I conclude by saying that if there are some hopes of a little better future, I don't think that we have paradise on earth within 15 years. No, but a little better future that is balance of forces moving to the benefit of popular classes. It ought to be it will be unequal. It will be unequal. Some countries will advance more than others. Possibly in some areas, some countries will advance more than others in other areas. But to come together, and that is my conclusion, we need an international. That is, we need patterns of organization which make possible a certain degree of coordination of the struggles, possibly common strategies for some targets, and revive a mood of real internationalism. That is solidarity of the people against all their ruling classes today, or most of them at least. And I think that this is the challenge today for all the progressive forces. And I say progressive, not all of them necessarily socialist or convinced that communism is something, is not just a utopia of another society based on solidarity instead of competition, etc. But who are aware of the dangers. Now, you see, in 1979, that is some years ago, I wrote as a conclusion of my book on Class and Nation a chapter or a conclusion with the title Revolution or Decadence. And I said, in history, in real history, the move of societies from one stage, I don't say even a one mode of production, to a higher stage of civilization, has been achieved in one of two ways. Either by revolutions, that means attempt to be lucid, to know what you want, and to be able to develop a certain strategy. That was the case for what has been called the bourgeois revolutions and the socialist revolutions. When one speaks of revolutions, we should not forget that there have been also bourgeois revolutions. That is attempt to be lucid. And I think that the 18th century in Europe, with the Enlightenment, was a serious attempt to be lucid, and I would say that the people of that time were lucid, if we compare them to their grandchildren today, of course. In absence of that lucidity, what do you have? You have the pattern of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire did not, we don't speak, nobody speaks of a feudal revolution. The Roman Empire moved in that part of the world, which was not the world, but in that part, I mean the Mediterranean European, South European, South and little of the West, not much more, to feudalism through decadence. The decadence of, that is, the change came by itself, without lucid forces creating it. Now, that was very costly, very, very costly. The barbarian invasions, the destructions, the de-urbanization, the reduction of the population, etc. Such a pattern today, which is probably what Trump could imagine, not much more than that, would be really a gigantic catastrophe. Because the means of destruction today have nothing to compare with what they were 2,000 years ago. And it could destroy the whole of humankind and nature today. And therefore we have a challenge which is... now, Marx never said that the class struggle leads necessarily to the victory of those who are able to move the society to a higher degree. He says this is possible, and also the two partners destroying one another is also, and he had probably in mind, he had certainly in mind even, the case of the Roman Empire, which means that we ought to be neither optimistic nor pessimistic, we ought to be realistic, or according to Gramsci, pessimistic in the analysis and optimistic in the will. Thank you.